Cleopatra, a femme fatale, a seductress who brought down great Romans, the greatest romantic heroine? Every bit of it is a lie, an elaborate fabrication concocted by her fiercest enemy and propagated for 2,000 years to come. A myth that you and I still believe to this very day. But what if I told you that her famous romances with Caesar and Antony were not love stories at all, but the coldest, most cynical, and most ingenious business ventures in history? That these were merely tools to execute her true, terrifying blueprint. A plan to conquer not just Egypt, but the entire world. A plan where Rome wouldn't swallow Egypt. Instead, Egypt would swallow and subjugate Rome. Today, we're going to crack open history's hidden archives and reveal her true, shocking scheme. Prepare yourselves, because after this video, you will never again look at the last queen of Egypt through the same eyes. Watch until the very end, and you will uncover a truth that has been hidden for 2,000 years. There's a deeply ingrained myth about Cleopatra, painting her as the tragic final queen whose life and death marked the end of independent Egypt and the twilight of an entire era. We've grown accustomed to seeing her as a symbol of a great civilization's decline, a beautiful, fated pawn in the hands of powerful Roman men. But here's a paradoxical fact that shatters that image to pieces. Cleopatra wasn't a victim of history. She was its most ambitious architect. Her reign isn't a tale of an ending, but a desperate and brilliant attempt to launch the boldest new world order project imaginable. She wasn't merely trying to save Egypt. She aimed to lead it, and leveraging Rome's resources, forge a hybrid Greco-Roman superpower centered not in Rome, but in her native Alexandria. So, let's immediately clarify the genre of our narrative. This won't be a mere biographical retelling or yet another romantic melodrama of love and betrayal against a backdrop of pyramids. No, this will be a true intellectual thriller, an epic drama about the clash of two worlds, two models for the future. On one side, the ironclad, pragmatic, and ruthless machine of the Roman Republic, devouring kingdoms one by one. On the other, the sophisticated, opulent, and intellectually superior Hellenistic world, which this machine was methodically grinding down. And at the heart of this collision stood one woman who chose not to defend herself, but to seize control of the machine itself. And what strikes me most here isn't so much the tragic end of her story, which is known to all, but the incredible audacity and sheer scale of her initial vision. In an era when all Eastern kingdoms either succumbed to Rome or were annihilated by it, Cleopatra saw in the chaos of the Roman civil wars not a threat, but a unique window of opportunity. She viewed the most powerful men of her time, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, not as masters, but as potential partners in history's greatest startup, the creation of a new universal monarchy that would unite Rome's military might with Egypt's culture, science, and untold riches. Just think about this idea. It was unthinkable. The entire world viewed Rome as an irresistible force, a gravitational center that attracted and destroyed everything in its path. Dozens of kings before Cleopatra had tried to buy Rome's loyalty, appease it, or simply sit on the sidelines, hoping to be spared. Cleopatra was the only one who dared to think differently. She offered Rome not subjugation, but synthesis. She proposed a new future where Rome would not be the hegemon, but merely one of two integral parts of something far greater, newer, and, from her perspective, more perfect. More than the fate of Egypt or the life of one queen was at stake. The very direction of Western civilization's development was being decided. Had Cleopatra won this struggle, we might be living in a world where the empire's capital was Alexandria, and Latin and Greek were two equally dominant languages of power and culture. The history of the Mediterranean could have taken an entirely different, non-Roman-centric path. Her project wasn't merely a political intrigue, it was an attempt to alter the very trajectory of history itself. That's precisely why I invite you to become not just a spectator, but a participant in this intellectual investigation. Our goal isn't to mourn the fate of the last queen, but to reconstruct and comprehend the logic behind these grandiose and almost insane ambitions. We'll attempt to understand why she believed her plan was feasible, how she nearly brought it to fruition, and what fatal error or historical inevitability ultimately led to catastrophe. This isn't a story about how ancient Egypt died, but about how an entirely new world could have been born. To grasp the audacity of Cleopatra's design, we need to momentarily leave the palace halls and descend into the streets of her capital, Alexandria. Try to truly feel this city. The air here wasn't crystal clear. It was a thick, spicy and humid blend, where the salty breeze of the Mediterranean Sea mingled with the sharp scent of tarred ropes and raw fish from the harbor, the aroma of Nile silt after the flood, and the sweet, almost cloying fragrance of exotic incense wafting from temples and opulent homes. In this air hung the scent of money, spices from Arabia, grain from the Nile Valley, papyrus, which was the paper of the entire ancient world. And through it all permeated the unavoidable background noise of any ancient metropolis, the smell of thousands of people and animals, street food cooking, and smoke from hearths. Now, listen closely. Alexandria was never silent for a second. It was a continuous cacophony. There was no single language here. It was a veritable Babel. You would hear the guttural chatter of local Egyptian farmers hawking their wares in the market, the crisp and rapid speech of Greek merchants and officials, commands in rough Latin shouted by Roman legionnaires stationed in the city, and a dozen more dialects, from Aramaic to ancient Hebrew. The soundscape was complemented by the creaking of carts, the clatter of hooves on stone pavements, the monotonous chanting of priests from the Temple of Serapis, and the lively, fierce debates of philosophers and scholars echoing from the famous Museion. This city was a living, breathing, arguing organism, simultaneously harboring the highest intellectual culture and the bustling chaos of a port. And this was precisely the defining characteristic of the era. It was a world of cultural schizophrenia. The Greek elite, to which Cleopatra belonged, lived in their own world, reading Homer and Plato, yet they ruled a country with a 1,000-year-old, utterly alien civilization. They were, in essence, a colonial administration that for 3 centuries never truly managed, or even particularly desired, to fully understand its subjects. This disconnect generated constant tension, palpable in everything from architecture to religion. And to survive and rule in such a world, one had to comprehend its unwritten codes, its internal operating systems. The first and most crucial code was the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. This wasn't merely order or justice. Ma'at represented the fundamental divine harmony of the universe, which the pharaoh was obligated to uphold on earth. Any violation, famine, war, a ruler's weakness, was perceived not as a political crisis, but as a disruption of cosmic balance. And most Ptolemaic kings ignored this code. They didn't speak Egyptian. They scorned local cults, deeming them barbaric. Cleopatra was the first in 3 centuries to grasp that to rule Egypt, one had to speak its language. One had to become a true pharaoh for the Egyptians, a guarantor of that very Ma'at. The second code was Greek pragmatism, pushed to the point of cynicism. For the Ptolemies, descendants of Macedonian conquerors, Egypt was not sacred land, but first and foremost a most valuable asset. It was a massive corporation dedicated to producing grain and wealth. Their task was the efficient management of this resource to fund their army, navy, and luxurious lifestyle. And the third code, which Cleopatra had to master perfectly, was the Roman concept of dignitas, dignity and authority. For a Roman aristocrat like Caesar or Antony, their entire lives were a race to augment their dignitas. Wealth, military victories, triumphs, all of it fueled their political ambitions. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. She didn't just offer them her love or an alliance, She offered them a resource to elevate their status in Rome. And now, we can formulate a precise, confident analogy. Ptolemaic Egypt in Cleopatra's time wasn't just a kingdom. Imagine a colossal, ancient, and incredibly wealthy corporation inherited from a brilliant founder, but suffering from decades of incompetent and corrupt management in the form of her predecessors. Its stock is plummeting, its best assets are being sold off for debts, and an aggressive corporate raider, Rome, is already at the doorstep, poised to swallow the entire company. And at this moment, Cleopatra steps into the CEO position, and instead of preparing for bankruptcy, she offers the raider something unimaginable, not just a merger, but the creation of an entirely new global corporation built upon their two companies, where she, Cleopatra, would hold the controlling interest. That was her master plan. The starting point, the very catalyst that set in motion an entire chain of incredible events, was death. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, or the flute player, died. He left his children not a thriving kingdom, but a colossal problem. Egypt was neck-deep in debt to Roman creditors, its political independence was a fiction, and the very royal authority rested solely on Rome's goodwill. Auletes' will was not an act of paternal wisdom, but a genuine trap. 18-year-old Cleopatra was supposed to rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. And this meant one thing. Real power passed not into the hands of the child rulers, but into those of the court clique, the boys' regents, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus. It was these three who became the engine of history that, unwittingly, gave rise to the phenomenon of Cleopatra. Their plan was simple and cynical, to turn the young king into their puppet and his intelligent, educated, and ambitious sister into an obedient accessory. They saw her as merely a temporary inconvenience, a girl who could easily be pushed aside from power, and then, perhaps, married off and forever confined to the palace. In their world, where women were mere bargaining chips in dynastic games, no other scenario was conceivable. They made the classic mistake of all short-sighted politicians. They underestimated their opponent, mistaking her youth and gender for weakness. But Cleopatra was forged from different material. She refused to play by their rules. Instead of assuming the role of junior partner, she immediately asserted herself as the sole and rightful monarch. This wasn't just youthful idealism, it was a revolution. She began minting coins with only her profile, erasing her brother's image. She signed state decrees using only her name. In a world where the Ptolemies had ruled in pairs for 300 years, even if formally, this was an unheard-of act. She wasn't just violating her father's will, she was shattering the entire established political tradition. She was proclaiming a new era, an era of singular rule. This had the effect of a bombshell on the court clique in Alexandria. Their reaction was not merely anger, but shock and fear. They realized they were dealing not with a naive girl, but with a ruthless and calculating politician who played ahead of the curve. Pothinus and his associates immediately launched a counter-offensive. They waged a full-blown information war against Cleopatra, accusing her of usurping power and attempting to sell Egypt to the Romans. They turned the army and the capital's inhabitants against her. And in 49 BCE, their plans seemed to succeed. Cleopatra was expelled from Alexandria and fled to Syria. Her enemies rejoiced. History, in their opinion, had ended. Yet, it was in exile that the monumental idea, destined to shape her entire future, truly took root. Finding herself a refugee, stripped of her throne and her coffers empty, Cleopatra refused to succumb to despair. She did something no one could have anticipated. Instead of seeking out patrons or begging for aid, she seized the initiative. Leveraging her father's old alliances and her own burgeoning authority, she assembled a mercenary army in Syria and marched back towards Egypt's borders. It was at this critical juncture that a profound realization crystallized. The existing power structure within Egypt was too corrupt, too ossified to ever truly accept her. Therefore, she needed to find leverage from an external source. That leverage emerged from the very chaos engulfing her chief adversary and potential ally, Rome. The civil war raging between Caesar and Pompey was, to her, not a threat, but a golden opportunity. And that opportunity solidified when Pompey the Great, defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus, fled to Egypt seeking asylum. The young Ptolemy's court advisors committed their second, and this time fatal, blunder. In an attempt to curry favor with Caesar, they ordered Pompey's assassination. By doing so, they didn't merely insult Rome, they showcased their profound political short-sightedness. Cleopatra, poised with her army at the borders, grasped this instantly. She understood the Roman psyche far better than the entire Alexandrian clique combined. She knew Caesar, arriving in Egypt hot on his enemy's heels, would be incandescent with rage at such a gift. And this was her moment to strike. It was here that her genius unfolded in its full splendor. She understood that Caesar was the ultimate linchpin. But how to reach him, circumventing her brother's army and Pothinus's spies? She devised a maneuver that would forever be etched into the annals of history. The legendary carpet, in which she was famously smuggled into the palace, was far more than a mere romantic gesture. It was, in fact, a brilliant covert operation. This audacious act signaled her presence on an entirely different plane. It demonstrated to Caesar that he faced not merely another supplicant, but a player his equal in daring and unconventional thought. The moment her loyal servant unfurled the carpet at the feet of the world's most powerful man, the old order in Alexandria crumbled. Cleopatra didn't just re-enter the game, she started a new one on her own terms. How did one woman, however extraordinarily intelligent, manage to defy the world's most formidable power and nearly succeed? The answer lies not in magic or feminine allure, but in a brilliant, almost engineering-like approach to statecraft. Cleopatra didn't simply act on intuition. She constructed a sophisticated mechanism where every single component served a precise purpose. The central metaphor for comprehending this intricate machinery isn't a wall, but a bridge. Her core vision was to forge a connection between two pillars: the wealth and sacred authority of Egypt on one side, and the military might and political dynamism of Rome on the other. She didn't attempt to fortify one pillar against the other. Instead, she built a bridge between them, intending to become its pivotal, load-bearing element herself. Let's peek under the hood of this intricate mechanism to grasp its intended operation. Step 1, the most crucial of all, involved seizing control of Rome's power generator. Cleopatra understood something other Eastern monarchs did not. Rome wasn't a monolith. It was an arena where several predators battled for absolute dominion. Her strategy wasn't to fight Rome as a system, but to back the strongest predator and make him beholden to her. Initially, that predator was Julius Caesar. She offered him more than mere money. She presented something far more valuable: legitimacy of divine scale and an inexhaustible wellspring of resources for his grand ambitions. Step 2 centered on reimagining the image of power within Egypt itself. Before Cleopatra, the Ptolemies were Greek rulers governing Egyptians. They remained outsiders. Cleopatra executed a masterful rebranding. She became the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. She participated in ancient religious rituals, presenting herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. This wasn't merely playing to the crowd. She transformed her authority from colonial to sacred. To the common Egyptian, she became not just a Greek queen, but a true pharaoh, a daughter of the gods. This bestowed upon her an immense reservoir of trust and domestic support, a level none of her ancestors had ever achieved. Step 3 involved forging a dynastic foundation for a new global order. The birth of Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was far more than a mere fruit of love. He was the single most vital component of her grand design. Caesarion was the living embodiment of that very bridge. In his veins flowed the blood of the greatest Roman and the blood of the most ancient pharaohs. He was the ideal heir, capable of ruling both Rome and Alexandria without alienating either side. He was a symbol and a guarantee of the future synthesis of two civilizations. This child was not just a human being, he was a political manifesto, living proof that her audacious project was indeed viable. Step 4, which she began to implement with Mark Antony, involved a gradual shift of the center of power from west to east. The donations of Alexandria ceremony, where Antony parceled out eastern kingdoms to his children with Cleopatra, was not an act of blind love, but a meticulously orchestrated political declaration. Antony and Cleopatra, in essence, announced the creation of a new Hellenistic empire, where Rome would be but one province, albeit the most significant. The capital of this new world was destined to be Alexandria, a hub of science, culture, and most importantly, finance. Rome provided the legions, and Egypt supplied the gold and grain to sustain them. Step 5 concerned the financial leverage. Cleopatra had absolute mastery over the art of financial management. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and control over grain shipments to Rome was an exceptionally potent tool of influence. In an era when the price of bread dictated political stability in the Eternal City, whoever controlled Egyptian grain held Rome's very pulse. Cleopatra transformed Rome's economic dependence on Egypt into her trump card. She didn't just pay Roman generals, she financed their armies, their political campaigns, making them her debtors not only financially but politically as well. Step 6, the most subtle of all, was cultural expansion. Cleopatra brought to Rome not only her charm, but also an idea, the idea of a Hellenistic monarchy, enlightened, deified, absolute. The Roman Republic, with its archaic institutions, was already creaking at the seams. Caesar, and later Antony, instinctively gravitated toward autocratic rule. Cleopatra offered them a ready-made, centuries-tested model of such power, one far more elegant and ideologically sound than a crude military dictatorship. She proposed they become not mere dictators, but god-kings. Here's what this mechanism looked like in action. Visualize the process. Cleopatra identifies the most powerful Roman leader, Caesar, Antony. Utilizing Egypt's financial and ideological resources, she makes him dependent on her and binds him to her objective. Simultaneously, she consolidates her power within Egypt, becoming a living goddess to her people. Then, she forges a dynastic link through a shared child, legitimizing the union of two worlds. Finally, she gradually begins to shift the political and economic center of gravity from Rome to Alexandria, transforming the Roman general from a partner into, essentially, her consort, a co-ruler in a new global empire. It was a plan of incredible boldness and grace, a miracle that nearly came to pass. We marvel at grand designs and colossal ambitions, but often overlook that behind every historical marvel stand ordinary individuals. The true magnitude of Cleopatra's vision can only be genuinely grasped through the experience of those whose hands helped build it. Consider this simple yet tangible fact. Year after year, a humble Egyptian peasant tilling his tiny plot of state-leased land in the Nile Delta produced a surplus of grain. This surplus, meticulously collected by an army of scribes and officials, was dispatched to colossal granaries and from there shipped to Rome. This peasant never saw the Eternal City and likely didn't even know of its existence. Yet, the calloused hands of that farmer and the generosity of the Nile's flood directly dictated the price of bread and therefore political stability on the opposite side of the Mediterranean. All the opulence of the Alexandrian court, all the gold with which Cleopatra paid Roman legions, was built upon the monotonous, unceasing toil of millions of nameless fellaheen. History favors its protagonists, the kings, the generals, the lovers. But Cleopatra's mechanism of power, like any complex machinery, could not operate without an entire team of unsung engineers and operators. And while the drama involving Caesar and Antony unfolded center stage, those without whom it all would have been impossible toiled in the shadows. These were her true, often overlooked heroes, whose names rarely grace history textbooks, but whose contributions were decisive. The first and foremost of these heroes was not a specific individual, but an entire caste, the Ptolemaic bureaucracy, headed by a figure we would today call a minister of finance or chief of administration. This person, the Dioiketes, managed the most sophisticated tax and administrative apparatus of the ancient world. It was he and his subordinates who were responsible for ensuring that the harvest was collected on time, accounted for down to the last grain, preserved, and converted into hard currency or export goods. They managed state monopolies on the production of papyrus, oils, and beer. Without their meticulous daily work, Cleopatra's treasury would have been empty, and her promises to Roman allies would have remained mere words. This was the cold, calculating brain of her economic empire. And speaking of specific individuals, one cannot overlook Apollodorus of Sicily. He was neither a general nor a nobleman. He was simply a loyal servant. Yet, Cleopatra entrusted her very life to him at the most critical juncture. It was Apollodorus who conceived and executed the audacious plan involving the carpet, secretly smuggling the exiled queen past her brother's guards directly into Caesar's chambers. This act demanded not only physical strength, but also incredible courage, resourcefulness, and, crucially, absolute dog-like devotion. In a world of palace intrigues where betrayal was the norm, having such a person ready to do anything for their mistress was worth more than an entire army. Apollodorus symbolizes how personal loyalty sometimes proves more vital than any political calculation. Beyond these key figures, Cleopatra relied on an entire network of inconspicuous helpers. These were her diplomats, conducting clandestine negotiations with Eastern potentates. These were spies, feeding her intelligence about the mood in the Roman Senate. These were scholars from the Alexandrian Museion, who advised her on matters of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. And of course, there were the captains and merchants who navigated her trade fleet across the entire Mediterranean, transforming Egyptian grain into political influence. Her strength lay not only in her own intellect, but also in her ability to discover and leverage the talents of others. To truly ground our narrative, let's touch upon one astonishing everyday detail that speaks volumes about this era and Cleopatra herself. In a world where dynastic marriages and the birth of heirs were pivotal political instruments, the question of birth control was no less important than managing the treasury. And the Egyptians had their own, quite specific methods. Ancient medical papyri describe contraceptive recipes, and one of the most well-known included crocodile dung. It was mixed with honey or a sour paste and used as a barrier method. From a modern scientific perspective, this sounds like wild superstition, but there was a certain logic to it. An acidic environment indeed possesses some spermicidal effect. This shocking fact reveals two crucial insights. First, it showcases Cleopatra's world as a place where practical, almost scientific observations were intricately intertwined with magic and ritual. Second, it reminds us that beneath the magnificent persona of a queen goddess lay a woman who, like so many others, confronted very earthly, physiological challenges and resolved them using the methods available to her. This woman, who meticulously planned the births of her children with cold political calculation, undoubtedly knew about these methods and quite possibly employed them. Her power over her own destiny extended even to her body, a concept truly revolutionary for that era. Cleopatra's meticulously crafted mechanism seemed to be operating flawlessly. Her alliance with Mark Antony, Rome's most powerful general, provided her with protection and military might. Control over Egypt's immense wealth ensured an inexhaustible financial pipeline. The birth of 3 children by Antony solidified the dynastic union. The donations of Alexandria became a bold manifesto for a new world order. Her grand design was nearing its dramatic culmination. But precisely at this peak of triumph, an ideal storm descended, a convergence of circumstances she couldn't fully foresee, transforming her greatest achievements into her most profound vulnerabilities. This storm bore the name of Gaius Octavian. Initially, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, was not perceived as the primary threat. He was young, sickly, lacked Antony's military charisma, and seemed merely a temporary figure, a pale shadow of his illustrious great-uncle. Both Antony and Cleopatra made the same fatal mistake. They underestimated him. They saw him as a rival, but failed to grasp that he represented an entirely new archetype of politician. Octavian was neither a brilliant general nor a fiery orator. His genius lay elsewhere, in cold, ruthless calculation and a masterful command of the new era's most potent weapon, propaganda. He was history's first true master of information warfare. And this is precisely where the entire dialectic of strength and weakness comes into sharp focus. The very elements that rendered Cleopatra and Antony's alliance so formidable became Octavian's perfect targets. Their love and personal devotion? Octavian spun this for the Roman people as shameful enslavement, portraying a great Roman hero as having fallen under the spell of a depraved Eastern queen. The wealth and luxury of the Alexandrian court? In his propaganda, they morphed into symbols of decay, effeminacy, and a betrayal of austere Roman virtues. Cleopatra herself, an intelligent and educated ruler, was transformed by his propaganda machine into a grotesque caricature, a treacherous temptress, an Egyptian snake dreaming of Rome's downfall. The strongest pillar of their grand project, their children and the donations of Alexandria, became their greatest vulnerability. What Cleopatra and Antony envisioned as the creation of a new universal dynasty appeared to Romans, poisoned by Octavian's propaganda, as a monstrous betrayal of national interests. For a Roman citizen, it was unbearable to hear that Roman lands were being handed out to foreign children, and that the true heir of Caesar was proclaimed not the legally adopted Octavian, but Caesarion, the Egyptian woman's son. Octavian masterfully played upon the Romans' xenophobia and national pride. He skillfully reframed the power struggle, transforming a civil war into a sacred war against an external enemy. And this enemy bore the name of Cleopatra. The culmination of this confrontation arrived with the publication of Mark Antony's will in Rome. Octavian illegally seized it from the Temple of Vesta and read it aloud before the Senate and the Roman people. Whether it was entirely authentic or partially fabricated, its contents were a death blow to Antony's reputation. In it, he not only confirmed all the gifts to Cleopatra's children, but most damningly to Roman ears, requested to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, alongside his queen. This was the final straw. A Roman general wishing to rest in foreign soil beside a foreign queen. In the eyes of Romans, this was the definitive proof of his downfall and apostasy. Everything Cleopatra had meticulously built over years collapsed in an instant. Her carefully constructed bridge between Rome and Egypt was blown to smithereens. Octavian had achieved his goal. The Senate declared war. But not on Antony. That would still have been a civil war. The Senate declared war on Cleopatra. The entire intricate plan was reduced to a simple military confrontation, one in which Rome, having mobilized all the resources of Italy and its western provinces, held an undeniable advantage. The intricate mechanism had broken down. The system faced a challenge for which it was utterly unprepared. And now comes the moment of truth, a dramatic pause before the final act. In 31 BCE, off the coast of Cape Actium, 2 fleets, 2 armies, 2 destinies converged. This was not merely a battle for power. It was a clash between 2 visions of the future. On one side, Octavian's fleet, embodying a unified, cohesive Roman world. On the other, the diverse fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, where Roman legions fought alongside Egyptian, Syrian, and Greek ships. It was the living embodiment of their idea of a hybrid empire. The outcome of this battle was meant to decide everything. But why, in the decisive moment of battle, did something go so terribly wrong? Why, according to most sources, did Cleopatra suddenly order her fleet to withdraw? And why did Antony, abandoning his army, rush after her? Was it cowardice, betrayal, or was there some other desperate plan we have yet to understand behind it all? To truly comprehend what transpired off Cape Actium, we must exercise intellectual honesty and reject the simplest, most tempting explanation, the notion of cowardice and panic. Most serious military historians today agree that the flight of Cleopatra and Antony was not a spontaneous act, but part of a pre-planned, desperate breakout strategy. They were trapped in the Ambracian Gulf. Octavian's fleet, under the command of the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was lighter, more maneuverable, and better equipped. The chances of victory in a traditional naval battle were infinitesimally small. Yet, their land army, stationed on shore, was still enormous and battle-ready. The plan, most likely, was this: draw Agrippa's fleet into combat, and then, under the cover of the general melee, the fastest squadron, Cleopatra's squadron, would break through the blockade and escape to the open sea, preserving their command structure and, most importantly, their treasury. This plan was risky, yet utterly logical from a military standpoint. Antony was meant to follow Cleopatra to maintain unified command and regroup forces for a continued land war, possibly in Egypt itself, where they had limitless resources. But something went awry. Perhaps the wind shifted at the wrong moment. Perhaps Agrippa deciphered their stratagem. Or perhaps, and this is most probable, discipline within Antony's fleet had already been undermined. Many Roman officers and senators, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had already defected to Octavian's side even before the battle. It's quite likely that a portion of the fleet simply failed to execute the breakout order, transforming an organized withdrawal into a chaotic rout. Thus, a theoretically brilliant tactical maneuver spiraled into a strategic catastrophe and complete defeat. And here we arrive at the pivotal question. Why was it so crucial to save Cleopatra's ships in particular? The answer is simple. Those ships literally held the war. They carried the entire war chest, the Queen's personal treasures, and Egypt's gold reserves. This was the very money funding Antony's entire campaign. To truly grasp the magnitude of these funds, let's momentarily step away from the battles and delve into economics. Egypt wasn't just a wealthy nation. It was the financial powerhouse of the ancient world. Its annual income surpassed that of any other Roman province, including the richest ones like Gaul and Hispania. Let's draw a tangible comparison. Upon conquering Egypt, Octavian gained access to a sum that allowed him not only to pay off all his veterans, but also to maintain a vast standing army, which became the bedrock of his power for decades to come. Egypt's annual revenue could fully finance, equip, and feed more than 20 Roman legions. That is, nearly the entire army required to control half of the known world. The war between Antony and Cleopatra was, in essence, a war of the West's resources against the East's, and the source of those Eastern resources was none other than Cleopatra. The Battle of Actium was not merely a naval engagement. It was a desperate attempt to rescue the largest venture capital fund in history from a hostile takeover. However, their grand project was built on more than just money. It was imbued with deep, almost mystical symbolism. Every action they took carried a hidden meaning, one that was clear to their contemporaries, but often eludes us today. The most striking example of this is not their love or their wars, but the names they bestowed upon their twin children. The boy they named Alexander Helios, and the girl Cleopatra Selene. Sun and moon. This was no mere poetic fancy. In Hellenistic cosmology, the sun and moon were divine twins, brother and sister, who together governed the universe. By giving their children such names, Antony and Cleopatra made an unequivocal statement. They weren't merely establishing a dynasty. They were declaring themselves the founders of a new cosmic order. Their children were destined to rule the world as the sun and moon rule the heavens. This was a political manifesto of titanic proportions, a signal to all the elites of the East. We are not just another set of rulers. We are the dawn of a new era, a new world order, divine and eternal. Every such gesture, from the names of their children to their self-deification as Dionysus and Isis Aphrodite, was a brick in the construction of a new ideology designed to legitimize their power over the entire Hellenistic world and ultimately over Rome itself. And now, having witnessed the personal audacity of an exiled queen who risked everything for a single encounter, the cold, calculated engineering with which she built her bridge between civilizations, the colossal economic might of Egypt fueling her ambitions, and the tragedy of the Battle of Actium, where her greatest strength became her gravest weakness, now all the disparate threads of the narrative weave into a single tapestry. The picture becomes terrifyingly clear. We stand on the precipice of a revelation, one far more complex and grand than a mere tale of love and war. For centuries, we've been led to believe that the Cleopatra phenomenon lies in her exotic beauty, her ability to seduce great Romans, or the tragic power of her love for Mark Antony. But this is merely the wrapping, a shimmering and beautiful foil obscuring the true essence. To reduce her story to a romantic drama is not just to diminish her, but to completely ignore the central question. And that question is, what did she truly want? What was the ultimate goal of her incredibly complex and high-stakes game? Was she simply a desperate patriot attempting to save her kingdom's independence from Roman absorption? No, that would be far too simplistic. So, what is the secret to the Cleopatra phenomenon? She was neither seductress nor victim. Her genius lay elsewhere. In an era when the entire world was divided into Rome and those whom Rome would conquer, she alone saw a third path. She understood that one didn't have to fight, submit, or flee. One could unite. She was the first and only politician of antiquity who attempted not conquest or defense, but synthesis. To hack into the Roman system from within, using its most powerful figures, and to fuse it with the cultural, financial, and ideological might of the Hellenistic East. She wasn't just trying to create an empire. She was trying to create an entirely new world. Let us picture the world she endeavored to build. It would have been a global empire, orchestrated from its intellectual and financial epicenter, Alexandria, an empire where both Latin and Greek would reign as official languages, where Roman legions, the finest soldiers on earth, would safeguard Greek philosophy, science and art, all fueled by Egypt's inexhaustible gold and grain. At its helm would stand not the Roman Senate nor a dictatorial general, but a deified Hellenistic monarch, a wise, enlightened, sacred ruler whose authority derived not merely from the swords of legionaries, but from millennia-old religious traditions. It would have been a world where the might of Rome was harnessed in service of Greek intellect. And this was no utopian fantasy. Her scheme was terrifyingly realistic, for it addressed the era's paramount challenge. The Roman Republic writhed in its death throes. Its ancient institutions proved incapable of governing a colossal empire. Rome desperately required a novel model of governance, and Cleopatra offered it. She looked at Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and saw in them not merely lovers or benefactors. She perceived them as ideal instruments for the execution of her grand design. These men yearned for sole power, yet they possessed neither the ideology nor the tradition to claim it. Cleopatra furnished them with everything, a ready-made model of sacred monarchy, polished over centuries, the ideological justification for their rule, and crucially, the funds to sustain it. Herein lay the secret of her charm. She seduced them less with her physicality than with a brilliant political vision, offering them what they desired above all else, legitimate and absolute authority. Her relationships with them were not mere alliances, they were the very methodology of synthesis. She fused the personal and the political into a single, indivisible instrument. Her children by Caesar and Antony were more than just offspring. They were living cornerstones in the foundation of her new world, potent symbols of two civilizations' amalgamation. Love, in her hands, became the ultimate political technology. And now, we can fully grasp the true magnitude of her vision. This was no mere politics. It was an attempt at deliberate civilizational engineering. All kings and generals before her thought in terms of victory-defeat, us-them. Cleopatra thought differently. She strove to forge a system where there would be no losers, only mutual benefit. This was a design of titanic, almost divine scale, to take the two most advanced yet warring cultures of her time and by sheer force of will fuse them into something new, viable, and more perfect. Thus, the enigma of Cleopatra lies not in her being the last queen of Hellenistic Egypt, but rather the first architect of a Greco-Roman world that was never born. Her story is not a tragedy of decline, but the chronicle of antiquity's most grandiose, unrealized project. She lost not because her plan was flawed. She lost because her opponent, Octavian, proved no less brilliant, yet his genius was directed not toward innovation, but toward the preservation and restoration of the old, purely Roman world. At the Battle of Actium, more than just two fleets clashed. Two alternative versions of the future collided, and the one that prevailed was simpler, more understandable, and far, far more ruthless. It would seem that with the defeat of Cleopatra and Antony, her grand project was utterly annihilated. Octavian Augustus achieved an unequivocal triumph. Egypt became a Roman province, and the world embarked on a purely Roman path of development. History was written by the victors, and in it, Cleopatra was relegated to the sole role of a treacherous Eastern queen. Yet, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that ideas, much like seeds, possess astonishing resilience. And Cleopatra's legacy, buried beneath Octavian's triumphal arch, sprouted through the centuries and reshaped the very world that had rejected her. The domino effect had begun, and it was now unstoppable. The first and most direct consequence of her defeat was the birth of the Roman Empire as we know it. Octavian, having emerged victorious, confronted the same conundrum that Caesar faced before him: how to govern an immense state for which republican institutions were hopelessly inadequate. And, ironically, in his quest for a solution, he was compelled, without ever admitting it, to draw upon his enemy's legacy. He crafted a regime he dubbed the Principate, where the Senate and republican magistracies were formally retained, but true power was concentrated in the hands of a single individual. But from where did he derive the ideological fuel for this power? It was precisely here that the virus Cleopatra had injected into the Roman political organism manifested itself. She introduced Rome to the concept of ruler deification. Following Caesar's death, Octavian secured his official deification and himself adopted the title Divi Filius, Son of the Divine. This was a purely Hellenistic, in essence, Egyptian maneuver, inconceivable for the old Roman tradition. The cult of the emperor, which would become the backbone of the Roman Empire for subsequent centuries, was a direct, albeit unwitting, appropriation from Cleopatra's arsenal. She demonstrated how power could be transformed from political to sacred, and Octavian, her vanquisher, became her most diligent student. But Cleopatra's legacy endures not only in high politics. We encounter it every single day without even realizing it. Take, for instance, our calendar. It was Julius Caesar, while in Egypt, and under the influence of Alexandrian astronomers, undoubtedly introduced to him by Cleopatra, who reformed the calendar. He introduced a system based on the solar year, with 365 days and a leap year every 4 years. This Julian calendar, with minor adjustments, has persisted to our modern era. Every time we check the date, we are, in essence, utilizing the result of the intellectual collaboration between Rome and Alexandria, made possible by the alliance of Caesar and Cleopatra. And what about architecture? Octavian, upon becoming emperor, commenced a magnificent reconstruction of Rome, famously declaring that he found a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Many architectural and decorative elements, obelisks, sphinxes, the use of Egyptian motifs in villa frescoes, came into vogue in Rome precisely after the conquest of Egypt. The so-called Egyptian style became a symbol of luxury and imperial grandeur. What an irony! Having conquered Egypt, Rome was aesthetically enchanted and subdued by it. The culture of the defeated civilization became part of the cultural DNA of the conquerors. But the most significant and most paradoxical aspect of Cleopatra's legacy is how her original vision was eventually utterly distorted and transmuted into its very antithesis. Her grand design envisioned an egalitarian synthesis of two cultures, a Greco-Roman world. She saw Rome and Alexandria as twin capitals, and Greek and Latin as the empire's dual languages. But what unfolded in reality? Rome became the singular, undisputed center. The Greek language rapidly marginalized in the West, and Greek culture came to be perceived as something secondary, albeit elegant. Instead of synthesis, absorption occurred. Her personal image suffered the same fate. A woman politician, an intellectual, a strategist who thought on the scale of entire civilizations, she was transmuted in posterity's memory into a one-dimensional caricature, a femme fatale whose story boiled down to two romantic entanglements. Her intellect and political genius were effaced, and her supposed sexuality pushed to the forefront. Thus did the victors exact their revenge after her death. They debased her magnificent political project to the level of a trivial love affair, rendering her image safe and unthreatening to the patriarchal Roman worldview. Such was the price of defeat, not merely the loss of a kingdom and a life, but the loss of her true identity in history. At first glance, Cleopatra's story seems a drama from the distant past, veiled in the dust of centuries and a romantic aura. But sweep away that dust, and we discover with astonishment that her world is eerily similar to our own. We too live in an age of globalization, in a world where civilizations clash, where the pragmatic and unifying power of some cultures interacts complexly with the ancient, diverse, and refined cultures of others. Today, just as 2,000 years ago, the same question looms: what will the future world order be? Which path shall we take? The path of absorption and standardization, or the path of synthesis and mutual enrichment? The story of Cleopatra and her confrontation with Rome is, in essence, the narrative of a struggle between two models of globalization. Octavian offered a simple and clear model. There is one center, Rome, and there is a periphery that must be assimilated, Romanized, brought to a common denominator. Everyone must become Roman, speak Latin, live by Roman laws. This is the melting pot model, where all differences are smelted into a single, standardized alloy. Cleopatra, conversely, was the architect of an entirely different model, a mosaic model, or if you prefer, a hybrid civilization. Her world was one where two capitals, two languages, two cultures could not merely coexist, but create something third, new, embodying the best of both. So why did her possibly more complex, nuanced, and progressive project suffer such a crushing defeat? Why did the model of synthesis lose to the model of absorption? The answer to this question is the very non-trivial lesson her story imparts to our 21st century. Her project failed because it was too intricate. It demanded intellectual effort from people, openness, the capacity to perceive value in the other. It demanded that the Roman elite acknowledge that their culture was not the sole, or in all respects the best. that there was something to learn from the barbarians. Octavian, however, offered Rome an idea that demanded no effort. It was simple, unambiguous, and appealed to the most primal instincts: fear and pride. His message was elemental. We are Romans, the bearers of valor and order. She is an alien, a corrupt Eastern queen who seeks to demolish our world and our values. This is a battle of us against them. In any historical epoch, such a black and white worldview, built on opposition and the hunt for an external enemy, proves far more effective and contagious than the complex notion of dialogue and synthesis. Simplicity invariably triumphs over complexity in the battle for the hearts and minds of the masses. And therein lies the central and perhaps most bitter lesson of this narrative for the 21st century. The dream of an intricate, multipolar, cosmopolitan world where diverse cultures respect and enrich one another is an incredibly fragile one. It is all too easily shattered by primitive, yet monstrously effective, instruments of populism, xenophobia, and national exceptionalism. Cleopatra's story serves as a stark illustration of how a brilliant and complex civilizational project can be torpedoed and sunk by a deftly orchestrated information war founded on the basest human emotions. Yet her defeat is not cause for despair. It is a catalyst for contemplation. Cleopatra's history reveals how incredibly high the stakes are in the struggle for the future. She reminds us that the path to synthesis and mutual understanding will always be more arduous than the path to isolation and hostility. Her story is not a condemnation, but an enduring reminder. To build a bridge between civilizations is immeasurably more challenging than to erect a wall. But it is precisely in the attempts to construct these bridges, even the unsuccessful ones, that the true grandeur of the human spirit resides. To grasp why Cleopatra's grand ambition was doomed, we must attempt the near impossible: to view her and her world through the eyes of her greatest adversary, Rome. And to do that, we must completely shed the simplistic, cartoonish image of ruthless legions marching under imperial eagles. The Roman Republic of the late 1st century before the Common Era was far more than a mere war machine. It was an extraordinarily complex civilization, grappling with a profound existential crisis, and its actions were driven by a stern, tragic, and unyielding logic all its own. To a Roman aristocrat, raised on tales of Cincinnatus, abandoning his plough to save the homeland, and Horatius defending the bridge, the primary enemy was not an external force, but rather an internal decay. And in their eyes, Cleopatra was not just an enemy. She was a virulent contagion, a very virus threatening the core of Roman identity itself. Let us imagine ourselves in the sandals of an average Roman senator. How wild, how utterly baffling must the world being forged by Antony and Cleopatra have seemed to him. Let us begin with Cleopatra herself. Her every strength, her sharp intellect, her mastery of many languages, her political adaptability, was, within the Roman frame of reference, perceived as a collection of vices. For a Roman whose ideal was the modest and virtuous matron, Cleopatra epitomized everything that was fundamentally wrong. She was a regina, a queen, a word that stirred a primal, almost genetic terror in every Roman, a stark reminder of the tyranny their ancestors had overthrown. Was she educated? Then she was cunning and duplicitous. Was she wealthy? Then she was pampered and depraved. Her political maneuvers were not seen as brilliant strategies, but rather as feminine wiles, sorcery, and seduction. And what of Mark Antony? In Rome's eyes, his story was the profoundest of tragedies. He was their hero, one of their finest generals, the very embodiment of Roman valor. And now this hero abandons his lawful Roman wife Octavia, the sister of Octavian himself, an unheard-of public affront, to go live with a foreign queen. He stops dressing as a Roman, participates in wild Eastern mysteries, proclaiming himself the new Dionysus. He distributes Roman provinces, won with the blood of legions, to his illegitimate children by this queen. For Rome, this was no mere political scandal. It was an act of civilizational betrayal. Antony had barbarized himself. He had ceased to be Roman, transforming into a slave and consort to an Egyptian sorceress. The cultural shock was absolute. When news reached Rome that Antony and Cleopatra were appearing publicly in Alexandria on golden thrones, dressed as the gods Osiris and Isis, it provoked no admiration. It ignited revulsion and fear. Roman power was a grave matter, almost sacrosanct, yet it always remained profoundly human. Rulers were magistrates, consuls, dictators, but men nonetheless. The very notion of a living, reigning god-king was to them an abominable Eastern despotism, the complete antithesis of their ideals of civic liberty and service to the state. Cleopatra's world seemed to them a mad, irrational theatre where every conceivable law of nature and society had been transgressed. And here we arrive at the tragedy of predictability. Octavian and Rome triumphed not because they were smarter or more cunning. They prevailed because they were simpler, more conservative. Their strength lay in their traditions, in their very predictability, in their fundamental unwillingness to embrace anything new or alien. Cleopatra offered a complex, multi-layered hybrid world of the future. But Octavian presented Rome with a straightforward and unambiguous slogan: "Let us return to the ancestral ways." He did not invent a new ideology. He merely activated the one already hardwired into the consciousness of every Roman. Octavian's propaganda struck its target with surgical precision because it appealed directly to the fundamental fears and core values of Roman society. She wants to be Queen of Rome. This was their most terrifying nightmare. Antony will betray us and move the capital to Alexandria. This was an assault on the sacred status of the eternal city. Octavian did not need to prove anything. He simply needed to show the Romans what they were already prepared to see: a dire threat to their way of life, their gods, their very heritage. Rome's strengths, its conservatism, its xenophobia, its unwavering adherence to tradition, the mos maiorum, became its primary weapon. It proved utterly unprepared for Cleopatra's new type of thinking, but it did not need to be. It simply rejected her idea as an alien implant. Cleopatra's tragedy was that she tried to negotiate, to entice, to outmaneuver a system that was fundamentally incapable of dialogue. For this system, only two states existed. Either you were Rome, or you were a Roman province. And when she offered a third option, the system malfunctioned and reacted in the only way it knew how, with the total annihilation of the perceived threat. We have admired her genius, her audacity, her titanic vision. But grand projects are never built from light and air. They always come at a cost, and more often than not, that cost is paid not in gold, but in human lives and moral compromises. And behind the radiant facade of Cleopatra, the philosopher queen and architect of a new world, lies her darker, more unsettling side. This is not a story about what she built, but about what she was willing to destroy for her ambition. Her hands, which sought to build bridges between civilizations, were stained to the elbow with blood. And that blood was her own kin. To understand the true price of her genius, we must speak of those who were sacrificed on the altar of her magnificent ambitions. The most striking and ruthless example of such moral compromise is the fate of her younger sister, Arsinoe IV. This was not some abstract political rival. This was her flesh and blood, a young woman who had grown up with her in the same palace. During the Alexandrian War, Arsinoe was proclaimed queen by the Alexandrian populace hostile to Cleopatra and became the banner of resistance against Caesar. After his victory, Caesar brought her to Rome and paraded her in chains during his triumph, the ultimate humiliation. But showing mercy, he did not execute her, instead exiling her to an honorable life in Ephesus, under the protection of the sanctuary of the goddess Artemis. There she lived for years, quietly, and it seemed safely. She was a living, yet neutralized, reminder of the past. But for Cleopatra, there were no neutralized threats. In her grand game of chess, any piece left on the board could one day check her king. As long as Arsinoe was alive, she remained a potential claimant to the throne, a rallying point for any conspiracy, a trump card in the hands of Roman enemies who could at any moment pull her out of mothballs and use her against Cleopatra. And in 41 before the Common Era, having solidified her alliance with Mark Antony, Cleopatra decided to eliminate this problem forever. At her insistence, and perhaps by her direct order, Antony's men dragged Arsinoe from the steps of the Temple of Artemis and murdered her. This was not merely political calculation, it was an act of monstrous sacrilege and cold-blooded sororicide. This act is a key to understanding her psychological transformation. The young woman who once fought for her rightful claim to the throne against usurpers had evolved into a ruthless monarch for whom the ends justified absolutely any means. The burden of power, the constant dread of betrayal, the solitude at the summit, and the sheer magnitude of her own mission changed her beyond recognition. The idealism of her youth, if it ever existed, had long since been incinerated in the fires of political struggle. She had learned the Ptolemaic court's cardinal rule: either you are the predator or you are the prey. And she became the most dangerous predator. She could no longer afford the luxury of sentimentality or familial affection. Every person in her orbit, including her own family, was assessed from a singular perspective. Were they an asset or a liability? A threat or a resource? But can we simply brand her a monster? Her logic, though brutal, was in its own way impeccable. She was building not just a kingdom, but an empire destined to endure for centuries. And the primary enemy of any empire is not an external foe, but internal discord, civil war. The entire history of the Ptolemaic dynasty was a bloody succession of family feuds for the throne. Cleopatra had witnessed this firsthand. She knew that a living sister was a ticking time bomb beneath the foundations of her future. By killing Arsinoe, she believed she was eradicating the seeds of future conflict, ensuring peace and stability for her son Caesarion and her children by Antony. It was an agonizing choice between her conscience and the future of her empire. And she chose the empire. Let us look once more at Arsinoe's story, but this time not as a political problem, but as a personal tragedy. Here was a girl who, by the will of court schemers, became queen for a few fleeting months. Then came the humiliating captivity, the triumph in Rome, where she was paraded in chains, gawked at like an exotic beast. Then years of quiet life in a foreign city, in a temple, haunted by perpetual fear and a forlorn hope. And finally, death at the hands of assassins sent by her own sister. Arsinoe is the most tragic victim on the altar of Cleopatra's success. Her story reveals that great historical projects are forged not only from ideas and ambitions, but also from shattered lives, from those who were stepped over without a second thought on the path to a goal. So what, then, is the price of Cleopatra's genius? It lies in the fact that her bright dream of a new, harmonious world was inseparable from her personal darkness. Her capacity to think on a civilizational scale coexisted with a willingness to ruthlessly eliminate anyone who stood in her way, even if it was her own sister. This ruthlessness was not a side effect, but an indispensable tool of her power. And it was precisely this dark side, so skillfully exploited by Octavian's propaganda, that ultimately helped destroy her. Her enemies portrayed her not as a politician, but as a monster. And looking at Arsinoe's fate, we realize with horror that in this propaganda, for all its cynicism, there was also a measure of terrible truth. When we speak of Hellenistic Egypt, we often envision a harmonious synthesis, a beautiful fusion of two great cultures. But this is a dangerous illusion. In reality, especially during the first 2 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, it was not a melting pot, but a zone of rigid cultural apartheid. Imagine Alexandria. It was not a single city, but 2 distinct worlds, separated by invisible walls. In the royal quarter, Bruchion, with its gymnasiums, theatres and library, lived the Greek elite. They spoke Greek, read Homer, disdained barbarian Egyptian customs, and lived as if they were still in Athens or Corinth. Yet, just a few blocks away, in the district of Rakotis, vibrated authentic Egyptian life, with its ancient temples, priests, language and traditions stretching back millennia. This was not a clash. It was the coexistence of 2 parallel universes that tried to intersect as little as possible. The Greeks, who arrived with Alexander the Great, brought with them rationalism, philosophy, and the cult of the beautiful human body. And what did they see in Egypt? A civilization worshipping gods with the heads of falcons, jackals, and crocodiles, obsessed with death, mummification, and the afterlife. To an enlightened Greek, this appeared as wild, irrational superstition. Conversely, to an Egyptian, whose world was permeated by the idea of divine order, Ma'at, the foreign Greeks with their boisterous political assemblies, naked athletic contests, and endless philosophical debates seemed superficial, frivolous, and devoid of genuine spirituality. This conflict of worldviews was so profound that for almost 300 years, most of the Ptolemies did not even attempt to learn the language of their subjects. They were strangers, and they knew it. But over time, it became clear that eternal rule, based solely on the might of mercenaries and a bureaucratic apparatus, was unsustainable. A bridge was needed. A unifying idea was essential, one that could merge the Greek minority and the Egyptian majority. And it was precisely here, on this fertile ground of cultural distrust, that the most astonishing and peculiar hybrids began to emerge. The first and most celebrated such hybrid, consciously engineered from above, was the god Serapis. This was Ptolemy I's brilliant political brainchild. He took the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis, who oversaw fertility and the afterlife, and clothed them in Greek attire. Serapis looked like the Greek Zeus or Hades, a mighty bearded man seated on a throne, yet possessed the functions of the Egyptian deities. He was a god of compromise, a deity of synthesis, understandable to both Greek and Egyptian alike. And his temple, the monumental Serapeum in Alexandria, became the principal religious hub of this new world. But alongside this engineered hybrid, organic ones also began to emerge. The most striking example was the Egyptian goddess Isis. Her cult literally burst beyond Egypt's borders, and like a potent virus spread throughout the entire Mediterranean. Yet this was no longer quite the same Isis worshipped in Thebes. Along the way, she had mutated. The Greeks identified her with their Demeter, goddess of fertility. The Romans recognized in her the Great Mother. She shed some of her specific Egyptian iconography, but gained universal traits of a forgiving, loving savior goddess. This phenomenon was not unique to Egypt. The same transformation was unfolding across the entire Hellenistic world. In distant Bactria, in what is now modern-day Afghanistan, Greek sculptors began to depict the Buddha in the likeness of Apollo, giving birth to the astounding Greco-Buddhist style. Ideas collided, blended, and forged something entirely new. So, how did the everyday person navigate this intricate tapestry? Their life was a constant act of cultural acrobatics. Imagine for a moment an ambitious Egyptian youth. At home, within his family, he bore his Egyptian name, Pachom, for instance. But to climb the ladder in the state administration, he would have to adopt a Greek name, Apollonius, perhaps. He had to learn the Greek language and master Greek laws because the country operated under 2 parallel legal systems, one for Greeks and another for Egyptians. His entire life was bifurcated. He was constantly forced to switch cultural codes, much like we toggle languages on a smartphone today. This daily experience of living at the crossroads of civilizations forged a new kind of individual, flexible, adaptable, yet perpetually grappling with an identity crisis. And this brings us back to Cleopatra. She wasn't merely born into this hybrid world. She was its ultimate and most perfect embodiment. Unlike her ancestors, she wasn't just a Greek woman ruling Egypt. She was both, simultaneously. She spoke both languages fluently. She could offer sacrifices to the Olympian gods, and an hour later appear before her people as the living embodiment of Isis. She thought in the categories of Greek philosophy, yet felt the sacred power of Egyptian tradition. She didn't just exist within this civilizational fault line, she learned to draw her strength from it. Cleopatra was the first and last ruler who didn't merely manage this melting pot, but was, in essence, its very product. And that is precisely why she was able to ascend so far. The conflict between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra wasn't fought solely on battlefields. Perhaps the decisive battle was won long before Actium, waged not with swords, but with words, whispers, and images. This was history's first total information war, with both sides wielding propaganda as their mightiest weapon. And the first to master this art to perfection was Cleopatra herself. She didn't merely rule, she purposefully and methodically constructed her public myth, transforming herself into a living icon. Her primary tool was deification. By presenting herself as the new embodiment of Isis, the most revered goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, she tackled several objectives at once. To the Egyptians, she became not merely another Greek ruler, but a sacred figure, a guarantor of fertility and order. And for the entire Hellenistic East, her image as Isis Aphrodite was a readily understood symbol of power, beauty, and divine legitimacy. Her propaganda machine ran ceaselessly. She minted coins, which served as the internet and television of the ancient world, reaching the furthest corners of her kingdom. And these coins carried an unambiguous message. She was depicted alone, a deviation from the tradition of joint rule. Her profile was strong and resolute, not merely beautiful, emphasizing her status as a ruler rather than just a woman. Often, she was portrayed with symbols of power and fertility, a diadem, a scepter, and a cornucopia. When Mark Antony appeared on the coins, he was shown on one side and she on the other, as two equally sovereign monarchs. And after Caesarion's birth, she minted coins where her image was juxtaposed with that of her son, a direct declaration of dynastic succession. Every detail, every symbol was meticulously planned. But for every action, there is a reaction. And opposing Cleopatra, the brilliant propagandist, stood an even more brilliant and far more ruthless master of black PR, Octavian. He understood that attacking Antony, a hero beloved by soldiers, head-on was risky. It was far more effective to strike at his weak link, the foreign queen. Octavian launched a campaign in Rome that, in its cynicism and effectiveness, could outdo any modern political strategy. Its goal was the complete dehumanization of Cleopatra and her transformation into absolute evil. She was portrayed as a drunken libertine, a sorceress who had ensnared Antony with love potions, and a treacherous Eastern despot dreaming of enslaving free Romans. And most astonishingly, these very myths, crafted by Octavian over 2,000 years ago, have survived to this day and shaped the image of Cleopatra perpetuated by mass culture. The legend of the femme fatale, who conquered great men with a single glance, is not a historical fact. It is a product of Octavian's propaganda. The notion that she was an exotic beauty whose power lay in her appearance is also his invention, designed to conceal her true strength, her intellect and political will. The Roman world couldn't concede that a woman could be smarter and more far-sighted than their best generals, so her genius was reduced to witchcraft and sexual charms. We still view Cleopatra through the eyes of her bitterest enemy. And the best example of how history is written by the victors is the interpretation of the most decisive event, the Battle of Actium. The official version, disseminated by Octavian's propaganda and cemented by court poets like Horace, was simple and humiliating. In the very thick of the battle, the cowardly Queen Cleopatra, seized by panic, turned her ships to flee. And Mark Antony, losing his head to love and forgetting duty and honor, shamefully abandoned his fighting soldiers and chased after her like a loyal dog. This version was perfect for Octavian. It portrayed his enemies not as valiant opponents, but as pitiful cowards and traitors, and his victory as not merely a military success, but a triumph of Roman valor over Eastern depravity. But what, in all likelihood, actually happened, judging by military logic and circumstantial evidence? As we've already discussed, this wasn't a panicked flight, but a pre-planned breakthrough of a blockade. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was trapped in the bay, their crews suffered from disease, and many allies had already defected to Octavian. There was no chance of victory in a pitched battle. The only logical solution was to attempt a breakout, preserving the most valuable part of the fleet, the treasury housed on Cleopatra's ships, and the command, in order to continue the war on land. This plan failed, turning into a catastrophe. But it was a warrior's plan, not the panicked flight of lovers. However, the truth wasn't important. The story was. And Octavian created a narrative that utterly destroyed Antony's reputation, justified the subsequent war, and legitimized his own sole authority. Thus, one specific event was rewritten and transformed into a powerful propaganda myth that has endured for centuries. If Caesar's assassination was the first point of no return, forcing Cleopatra to seek a new foundation, then the second, and most fatal, occurred within her own alliance. This was the moment when her brilliant and subtle plan to create a hybrid world was irreversibly warped. When the elegant idea of synthesis was supplanted by brute force and personal ambition. And this betrayal was not committed by an enemy. It was committed by her closest ally and lover, Mark Antony. The fatal decision was not a single act, but a gradual yet relentless abandonment of the project's very essence. The original intention was to use Roman power to build something new, something surpassing both Rome and Egypt. But at some point, the end stopped justifying the means. The means, Antony's military might and his personal power, became ends in themselves. This process began when Antony, intoxicated by the wealth of the East and the boundless opportunities afforded by his alliance with Cleopatra, stopped playing the role of a Roman proconsul, building bridges with the East, and began to inhabit the role of an Eastern monarch. He ceased to be a partner in the creation of a Greco-Roman world, and instead desired to become its sole master, seeing Cleopatra no longer as a co-architect, but as his queen consort. He forgot that his strength and authority stemmed entirely from his Roman identity, from his legions, from his support in the Senate. Instead of subtly and gradually Hellenizing Rome, he began to crudely and demonstratively orientalize himself, causing shock and revulsion among his own Roman comrades, and this immediately led to a profound internal rift. In Antony's camp were numerous distinguished Romans, senators, generals, who had followed him not because they believed in the idea of synthesis with Egypt, but because they were loyal to him, Mark Antony, as their leader, as the heir to Caesar's legacy. They hoped that upon defeating Octavian, he would lead Rome, perhaps reform it, but remain Roman. And now they watched in horror as their leader, before their very eyes, transformed into something alien. A representative of this old guard could be considered Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a respected aristocrat and consul. He was the embodiment of Roman valor and pragmatism, and he could not reconcile himself with what their camp was becoming. Imagine their dialogue, which surely unfolded countless times in the antechambers of the Alexandrian palace. "Mark," Ahenobarbus might have said, "what are you doing? We followed you to rule Rome, not to become courtiers in an Egyptian harem. These golden thrones, these titles of King of Kings for children, you are humiliating us. You are destroying your own authority, your dignitas, in the eyes of every Roman, every legionary." And in response, He would hear the words of a man who had already crossed the Rubicon and saw no way back. "Domitius, you think too narrowly. You see only Rome, but I see a new world. Their old laws and traditions are dead. They led the Republic to ruin. I am building a new empire, and its capital will be here, at the center of the world, not in some Italian backwater." It was a dialogue of the deaf. One still thought in terms of Roman politics, the other already saw himself as Alexander the Great. And the most powerful symbolic act that marked this definitive break was Antony's divorce from Octavia. This was not merely a personal insult to Octavian and his sister, it was an act of political suicide. Octavia was not just a woman, she was a symbol of peace and unity. Her marriage to Antony was the linchpin that kept the triumvirate from dissolving. She was a respected Roman matron, a paragon of virtue. By sending her a letter of divorce, Antony publicly severed the last thread connecting him to the Roman establishment. He was burning bridges. This act was a declaration legible to every Roman heart. It screamed, "I choose not Rome, I choose Egypt, I choose Cleopatra, I no longer play by your rules." It definitively confirmed Rome's deepest fears and the boldest claims of Octavian's propaganda machine. He ceased to be one of us, temporarily misguided, and transformed into one of them, a traitor. For many of his comrades, this was the final straw. Mass desertions followed. Not only Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, but other influential Romans like Lucius Munatius Plancus fled his camp for Rome, carrying with them not just military plans, but more crucially, the moral mandate for war. Thus, the grand vision of synthesis was betrayed from within. Antony, who was meant to be the Roman pillar of that bridge, himself hacked it down. He failed to maintain the delicate balance. He didn't grasp that his power in Rome was derived from his very Roman identity. In attempting to become an Eastern monarch, he squandered the one thing that made him a true contender for world dominion, the loyalty of his legions and his Roman supporters. Cleopatra had provided him with the vision and the resources to forge a new world, but in his relentless pursuit of absolute personal power, he shattered the most vital instrument for its realization, himself. The defeat at Actium was merely the inevitable consequence of this internal, ideological, and psychological unraveling. When the dust of the final battles settled and Alexandria fell, a deafening silence descended. And in that silence, it became undeniably clear that the world had changed forever. This was no mere conquest. It was a complete societal reset for the Mediterranean world. And in this new reality, there were undeniable victors and tragic losers. The primary beneficiaries weren't just Octavian and his immediate circle. An entire class emerged triumphant, the Italian elite, senators, and equites. For them, an incredibly rich new frontier unfurled. Egypt became for them what the Americas would become for Europeans 1,500 years later. A boundless fount of untold wealth, new offices, vast lands, and unparalleled career opportunities. The position of prefect of Egypt emerged as one of the empire's most prestigious and lucrative appointments. The true losers, however, weren't so much the ordinary Egyptians, for whom one foreign master simply replaced another, but rather the Greco-Macedonian aristocracy, who for 300 years had considered Egypt their personal domain. These individuals, descendants of Alexander's conquerors, accustomed to surveying the world from the lofty heights of their gymnasia and libraries, were in one swift stroke reduced to the status of wealthy but powerless subjects. Their power, their privileges, their very sense of self, all were utterly obliterated. Only yesterday they had been negotiating partners with Rome. Today, they were merely the upper echelon of a native administration within a Roman province. This was more than just a political setback. It was a profound cultural emasculation. Their world had crumbled. The economy of this new world was quite literally built upon the bones and treasures of the old. The immense wealth of the Ptolemies wasn't destroyed. It was expropriated and centralized. The colossal financial pump that was Egypt didn't break down. It was merely reoriented, its flow redirected from Alexandria directly to Rome. Cleopatra's gold, meticulously hoarded to finance her envisioned new empire, instead funded Octavian's legionaries, transforming them into his fiercely loyal personal army. The unending stream of Egyptian grain, once a tool of her diplomacy, now became Octavian's instrument for controlling the hungry Roman plebeians. He supplied the capital with cheap bread, securing eternal popularity and stability for his regime. This economic overhaul redrew the world's map entirely. Alexandria, once envisioned as a potential world capital, was reduced to merely the primary regional office managing Rome's most prized asset. All financial and trade routes, once converging on multiple hubs, now funneled into a single destination, Rome. The world ceased to be even bipolar, as it had been during the struggle between Antony and Octavian. It became utterly unipolar. Every decision was made in Rome, every treasure flowed to Rome, all political life orbited Rome. Cleopatra's empire, had it come to fruition, would have been decentralized and cosmopolitan. The empire Octavian forged was rigidly hierarchical and Roman-centric. This monumental upheaval birthed an entirely new psychology among the survivors. For the Greek elite of the East, this was a collective trauma that resonated for decades. They were overwhelmed by a sense of humiliation and powerlessness. Their language, the tongue of Homer and Plato, became the language of the subjugated. Their culture, which they had considered the pinnacle of human intellect, was now valued by Romans merely as elegant entertainment or a convenient tool. In response, they developed a complex psychological defense mechanism, an internal cultural superiority coupled with external political obedience. They became the finest physicians, teachers, rhetoricians, and administrators for their new masters, preserving their identity through service to the empire. In Rome, conversely, an unprecedented euphoria reigned. The triumph over their last great rival, the subjugation of fabulously wealthy Egypt, all this instilled in Romans a sense of absolute, divinely ordained supremacy. They definitively embraced their historical mission, their right to rule the world. Imperium sine fine, an empire without end. The psychology of republican citizens, accustomed to constant struggle and, at least formal equality, gave way to the mindset of imperial overlords. This victory cultivated in Romans a unique blend of arrogance, a profound sense of responsibility for the world's destiny, and deep disdain for all things non-Roman. The world was bifurcated into them, the masters, and everyone else, the subjects. This psychological chasm would become one of the primary driving forces behind the entire subsequent history of the Roman Empire. Behind every grand political drama, a profound idea always lurks. The struggle between Cleopatra and Rome was not merely a clash of armies and ambitions, it was a battle of philosophical concepts, of two divergent visions for how the world should be ordered. At the heart of Cleopatra's entire project lay a potent philosophical idea that permeated the entire Hellenistic era. This was the concept of oikumene, or the inhabited world, conceived as a unified cultural and political sphere. This idea, born of Aristotle's students following the campaigns of Alexander the Great, posited that the world should not be divided into barbarians and Hellenes. Instead, it should be united under the rule of an enlightened, deified monarch who would bring the light of Greek culture, law, and order to all peoples. This was the philosophy of universalism and cosmopolitanism. The intellectual engine, the power behind the throne of this era, was not a single philosopher, but an entire school of thought that Cleopatra absorbed from childhood: Alexandrian Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. The Alexandrian Museion, where she was educated, was no mere library. It was a melting pot, where the Greek rational philosophy of Plato and Aristotle blended with ancient Egyptian mysticism, Chaldean astrology, and Persian dualism. Thinkers from this circle believed that a single divine truth underpinned all religions and cultures, and the task of the wise ruler was to grasp this truth and embody it on earth. For them, a monarch was not simply an administrator. They were an intermediary between the world of the gods and the world of humankind, a living embodiment of the Logos, the universal reason. And it was precisely this role that Cleopatra embraced when she declared herself the new Isis and her son the new Horus. Her project was an attempt to translate this philosophical doctrine into realpolitik. She aimed to create not just an empire, but the ideal Platonic state, governed by philosopher kings. Her court in Alexandria was more than a venue for lavish feasts. It was a vibrant hub of intellectual life where poets, scholars, and philosophers held as much sway as generals. She offered Rome not merely an alliance, but a new, more refined ideology of power, rooted not in brute force, but in divine wisdom and knowledge. Yet, this universalist and cosmopolitan philosophy faced off against another, equally potent and far more pragmatic doctrine: Roman Stoicism. This was a philosophy perfectly suited for empire builders. Stoics, like Cato or later Seneca, also believed in a single cosmic law, but for them, this law was not a mystical revelation, but a stern duty, officium. Their ideal was not a philosopher king, but a citizen soldier who courageously and uncomplainingly fulfilled their duty to the homeland. For a Stoic, the paramount concern was not the pursuit of abstract truth, but service to the state, upholding order and traditions, mos maiorum. For them, power was not a privilege, but a heavy burden to be carried with dignity and without emotion. It was upon this philosophical bedrock that Octavian was forged. His image as first among equals, his feigned modesty, his constant appeals to duty and the precepts of their ancestors, all of it was pure Stoic rhetoric. He countered Cleopatra's Eastern decadence, emotionalism, and extravagance with stern Roman virtue, restraint, and service. This was not just a political slogan, it was a clash of two worldviews. On one side, Hellenistic idealism, dreaming of a new, unified humanity. On the other, Roman pragmatism, asserting that there was only one duty to Rome. The clash of these ideas shaped real politics. When Cleopatra and Antony declared themselves the new Isis and Dionysus, they acted within the Hellenistic philosophy of deified power. When Octavian refused a king's title and called himself merely princeps, first citizen, he operated within the Roman Stoic tradition. Their entire struggle was, in essence, a debate about the nature of power. Is it a divine gift that allows a ruler to stand above the law and create a new world? Or is it a heavy civic obligation that compels a ruler to obey the law and preserve the old world? In this battle of ideas, Roman Stoicism triumphed. But the paradox is that, in winning, it itself mutated, eventually absorbing many elements of its defeated adversary. The idea of the emperor's deification, albeit in a more restrained form, did become part of Roman ideology. The philosophical debate didn't end. It merely shifted into a new, hidden phase. Great systems, built around the genius of a single individual, possess a fatal vulnerability. They die with their creator. And Cleopatra's system, her grand project of a hybrid world, was no exception. Immediately after her suicide in August of 30 BCE, it didn't just begin to unravel. It collapsed, instantly, with terrifying speed. This was not a slow process of entropy, as with the empire of Alexander the Great, which his generals tore apart for decades. Cleopatra and Antony's system extinguished like a lamp that had run out of oil. There was no external enemy to deal the final blow. Octavian had already won. The system began to devour itself from within because its soul, its will, its sole center of gravity had vanished. The struggle for succession that followed was not long and bloody, but short and humiliating. The heirs, Antony's remaining generals, allied kings, garrison commanders, did not fight each other for the right to continue the great work. They fought for the right to be the first to betray it and beg forgiveness from the world's new master. The grand idea of synthesis, for which they had been prepared to die just yesterday, evaporated. It proved not to be a robust ideology, but the personal charisma of two individuals who were now dead. Their motley army, that prototype of a multicultural empire, transformed into a ship without a captain or a chart, and every officer on board simply tried to save their own skin by launching their personal lifeboat. The Roman legions stationed in Egypt swore allegiance to Octavian without a moment's hesitation. For them, the war was over. They were Romans, and Rome now had one undisputed leader. Cleopatra's pride, the Egyptian fleet, surrendered without a fight. Eastern potentates, who just yesterday had sworn fealty to Antony, now scrambled to Octavian's camp, bearing gifts and declarations of submission. Not a single soul dared to rally behind the fallen queen or continue her struggle. This was the most damning epitaph for her grand design. It was so intrinsically tied to her person that it couldn't survive her by even one day. She wasn't merely its heart, she was its entire nervous system. And with her death came paralysis. Yet, amidst this maelstrom of betrayals and surrenders, there remained one last, most precious remnant of her magnificent vision. The final vessel of her true idea, the living embodiment of everything she had lived and died for, her eldest son, Ptolemy XV, Caesarion. He was 17 years old. Through his veins flowed the blood of Julius Caesar and the last pharaohs. He was the very bridge between Rome and Egypt she had so meticulously constructed. And in her final desperate days, Cleopatra made one last, desperate gamble. She sought to save not herself, but him. She sent him south with immense treasures towards the Red Sea coast, hoping he could escape to India or Arabia, weather the storm there, and one day return. Caesarion was almost safe, but he was betrayed. His own tutor, a Greek named Rhodan, convinced the young man that Octavian, renowned for his clemency, would spare him and allow him to rule Egypt as a client king. He persuaded him to return to Alexandria. It was a trap. Octavian was no sentimental fool. He was a politician, thinking with an iron, ruthless logic. When informed of Caesarion's capture, he is said to have quoted a line from Homer: "It is not good to have many Caesars." His verdict was predetermined. As long as Caesar's son lived, Octavian's power would always have a potential alternative. As long as Caesarion breathed, the spectre of Cleopatra would haunt the world, and there would always be those eager to rally around his name. Caesarion's death was not a public execution. It was a quiet, methodical elimination. The last pharaoh of Egypt, son of the two greatest figures of his age, was strangled somewhere in an Alexandrian barracks. His death was more than a mere murder. It was a symbolic act that heralded the end of not just a dynasty, but an entire epoch, an alternative vision of the future. By killing Caesarion, Octavian didn't merely eliminate a rival, he tore down the very bridge Cleopatra had painstakingly built. He severed the last knot connecting Rome and Egypt. With the last breath of this young man, the final hope for a Hellenistic world also died. The Roman era had truly begun, finally and irrevocably. History isn't just written by the victors, it's also edited, polished, and bequeathed in the version most convenient for them. And Cleopatra's legacy fell victim to the most successful censorship campaign in history. Immediately following her death, centuries of oblivion began. But this wasn't a total erasure of her name. On the contrary, her name was on everyone's lips. It was her essence that was forgotten. Octavian's propaganda proved so effective that the image of the intellectual queen, the architect of a new world, was expunged from collective memory. It was replaced by a simplistic and demeaning caricature, enthusiastically embraced by Roman poets and historians. To Horace, she was fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. To Plutarch, writing more than 100 years later, she was the heroine of a grand romantic tragedy. Her political genius was buried under tons of romantic myths. Then a new era dawned, and another, even denser veil of oblivion descended upon Cleopatra's legacy: Christianity. For the early church fathers, a pagan queen who worshipped animal-headed gods and lived in open alliance with two men was the embodiment of sin and lust. Her story transformed into a cautionary parable about the perils of feminine wiles and worldly temptations. She became a new Eve, tempting a new Adam, Antony, and leading him to ruin. While Arab scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba carefully preserved, translated, and commented on Alexandria's scientific heritage, the works of Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen, the political history of its last queen held no interest for them. Thus, while the scientific genius of her era was saved, her own genius was condemned to obscurity. And then, 1,500 years later, in the early 17th century, a miracle occurred. One man, a genius from a distant northern land, took Plutarch's old, dog-eared account and breathed new, incredible life into it. His name was William Shakespeare. His play, Antony and Cleopatra, marked her second birth. But this was not a resurrection of historical truth. Shakespeare wasn't interested in her political projects. He took the Roman-created myth of great love and tragedy and infused it with such psychological depth, such poetic power, that this image became more real to Western civilization than history itself. Shakespeare's Cleopatra, infinitely mutable, capricious, passionate, wise, and tragic, forever cemented her status as the greatest romantic heroine. He didn't save her from oblivion. He elevated her distorted image onto a pedestal. But each new age read her in its own way, imbuing her image with its own meanings and fears. The 19th century, an era of colonialism and Egyptomania sparked by Napoleon's campaigns, saw something new in her. A thick layer of Eastern exoticism was added to the romantic image. She became a symbol of the mysterious, sensual, dangerous, and decadent East. Orientalist painters depicted her semi-nude, reclining on silks, surrounded by dark-skinned servants and venomous snakes. She transformed from a person into a cultural trope, into a European man's erotic fantasy of a conquered and seductive Orient. The 20th century, the age of cinema, pushed this trend to its extreme, transforming Cleopatra into a global pop culture phenomenon. The 1963 film starring Elizabeth Taylor definitively cemented this myth in the minds of billions. Cleopatra became synonymous with extravagant luxury, scorching beauty, and epic romance. Her story was distilled into a parade of magnificent costumes, lavish sets, and tear-jerking scenes with Caesar and Antony. The historical figure was utterly consumed by her Hollywood avatar. It was only towards the close of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st that her third, and this time genuine, rediscovery truly began. Historians, weary of romantic clichés, started asking fresh questions. They turned not to poets, but to primary sources, to papyrological evidence, to numismatics, to archaeology. They began examining her tax reforms, her administrative policies, and analyzing the imagery on her coinage. And from beneath centuries of accumulated myths, relentless propaganda, and Hollywood sheen, another Cleopatra slowly began to emerge. A brilliant administrator, a polyglot, a seasoned diplomat, and the architect of the most audacious geopolitical project of her age. Only now, 2,000 years later, are we truly beginning to reacquaint ourselves with the authentic Cleopatra VII. Her genuine story is just now unfolding. And so, having traversed this long journey, from the audacious paradox of her vision to its tragic collapse, from the profound depths of political calculation to the lofty heights of philosophical ideals, we now complete the circle. We began by asserting that Cleopatra was not a victim, but rather the architect of a new world, one intended to synthesize the might of Rome with the wisdom of the East. She grappled with the central challenge of her era, the relentless expansion of Rome, offering not resistance, but integration. And what do we find at the end? Her project ultimately failed. Rome triumphed, devouring and assimilating Egypt. Yet just a few centuries later, this same omnipotent Rome would confront that very problem, albeit on a different scale. It would prove incapable of managing its gargantuan empire, eventually fracturing into two distinct entities, the Western and Eastern Roman Empires. And the capital of this new Eastern Roman Empire, which we know as Byzantium, would become Constantinople, a city founded on the site of an ancient Greek colony. This empire would speak Greek, its culture would be distinctly Greek, and its rulers would style themselves not emperors, but basileus, in the Greek fashion. The ideology of this new empire would be forged from a synthesis of Roman statecraft, Greek culture, and a new universal religion, Christianity. It turns out then that Cleopatra's vision of a Greco-Roman empire centered in the East ultimately prevailed after all. But it triumphed too late, in a different guise, and without her at its helm. History came full circle, returning to the very model she had proposed, but it required 300 years and the collapse of Rome itself to do so. And this brings us to the central, irresolvable paradox of her entire history. Cleopatra was a genius, truly ahead of her time. Her idea was absolutely sound and historically prescient. Yet, it was precisely her genius and foresight that ultimately led to her downfall. She presented the world with a solution for which it was not yet prepared. She spoke the language of the future to people still steeped in the paradigms of the past. Her project was too intricate, too elegant, too rational for an era that demanded straightforward answers, brute force, and easily digestible slogans. It seems then that to triumph in history, one must not only be right, one must also be perfectly timed. This is not merely the tragedy of one woman, it is the tragedy of every great innovator. An inventor who created a steam engine in antiquity would have been ridiculed, for there were no factories yet, no railroads to run on. A scientist who uncovered the laws of genetics before the invention of the microscope would have been deemed insane. Cleopatra was likewise a premature genius in politics. She designed an operating system for a future global empire, but tried to install it on hardware that was fundamentally incompatible with it. And the system crashed, issuing a fatal error message. We can admire her intellect, we can sympathize with her fate, we can study her methods. But the deeper we delve into her history, the clearer it becomes that she was trapped in an insoluble contradiction. To realize her project, enlightened and humanistic at its core, a synthesis of cultures, she had to be a ruthless tyrant, even murdering her own sister. To carry the torch of Hellenism, she was forced to rely on the brute force of Roman legions. She tried to build paradise using infernal tools. And this duality, this internal conflict between a noble aim and base means, ultimately tore her apart. And now, looking upon this entire grand and tragic cycle, from conception to collapse, from collapse to the paradoxical resurgence of her idea in a different epoch, we are left with one central question, to which there is no, and can be no, definitive answer. Was Cleopatra a visionary genius whose dream was simply too vast for her time, or was she merely an adventuress whose immoderate ambitions and fatal missteps simply accelerated the inevitable fall of her kingdom? Is her story an inspiring testament that even one person can challenge the currents of history, or is it an eternal warning that swimming against the tide is ultimately futile?